On a cold November afternoon in a crowded grocery store, an elderly black veteran named Walter Hayes stood quietly at the register, counting coins with trembling hands to pay for a single loaf of bread, while the people behind him sighed, whispered, and pulled out their phones to record. Nobody in that line knew who Walter really was. Nobody knew what he had survived, what he had sacrificed, or what had been stolen from him by a man powerful enough to rewrite history. And nobody, not one person in that store, could have predicted what was about to happen next. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Greenfield Supermart on Elm Avenue was the kind of place that felt cheerful from the outside. Wide glass doors, hand-painted sale signs taped to the windows, a little bell that chimed every time someone walked through. But on a Thursday late afternoon in November, when the sky outside had turned the dull gray of old pewter, and every working person in the neighborhood had decided to stop in on their way home, the store felt less like a neighborhood staple and more like a pressure cooker with fluorescent lighting. Every checkout lane was open. Every one of them had a line. Shopping carts bumped against each other at the ends of the aisles. Kids tugged at sleeves. People scrolled through phones with the glazed expression of someone who had been waiting just a little too long. The whole place hummed with that particular tension that builds in public spaces when too many people are tired and in a hurry at the same time. But Walter Hayes stood at Register 7. He was 73 years old, with a frame that had once been broad and straight, but had settled over the decades into something quieter. Shoulders that curved slightly inward, a posture that still held its dignity, even as it acknowledged the weight of years. His hands, resting on the edge of the conveyor belt, were large and deliberate. The knuckles were scarred in the faint way that spoke of rough work done long ago, and they moved with a careful steadiness as he reached into the front pocket of his jacket. The jacket itself was a deep navy, worn at the cuffs with a small American flag pin on the lapel. His cap, faded olive green with gold lettering that read U.S. Army Veteran, sat straight on his head, the brim level. The way a man wears something he is proud of without needing to make a show of it. His shoes were clean. His shirt was tucked in. He had placed his items on the belt one by one when he first arrived at the register. A loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, a small jug of milk, a can of soup, a box of oatmeal, and a stick of butter. 6 items. He had arranged them neatly, not in a pile, but in a row, the way a man arranges things when he wants to take up as little space as possible. The register had beeped its way through each one. The total on the screen now read $16.26. Walter looked at the number for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch, the kind with a drawstring, the kind that had been washed so many times it was soft as skin. And he began to open it carefully, spreading it flat on the little counter beside the card reader. Coins, some quarters, several dimes, a scattering of nickels. He lifted them out one at a time and began to count, his lips moving slightly, his index finger touching each coin as it was placed in a small, deliberate pile. Behind him, the line had 7 people. The first was a woman in her late 30s with a toddler in the cart and a handbasket over her arm. She checked her phone. Then she checked it again. Then she looked at the back of Walter's head with an expression that was not yet impatience, but was already heading there. The second was a man in a business suit who had loosened his tie and was holding 2 bottles of wine and a frozen dinner. He exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath that said, "I don't have time for this," without saying a word. Further back, 2 college-aged women in matching athletic gear were whispering to each other. One of them glanced toward the other open registers. Both of them were already visibly calculating whether it was worth it to move. Emily Hartwell, the cashier at Register 7, was 22 years old and had been working at Greenfield for just over a year. She was good at the job, quick with the scanner, kind with the regulars, patient with the coupons, but she had never quite figured out how to handle the particular kind of discomfort that came with moments like this one. She watched Walter count his coins with an expression that moved between concern and helplessness, hovering in the space between wanting to help and not knowing how to do it without making things worse. The total was $16.26. She could see, from the way Walter was organizing the pile, that he was getting there, but slowly. She said nothing. She waited. The woman with the toddler shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The little boy in the cart grabbed the side railing and shook it, making it rattle. She patted his hand without looking at him. "Excuse me," said the man in the loosened tie, addressing no one in particular, but clearly addressing the situation. "Is there another register open?" "All lanes are open, sir," Emily said, not unkindly. He made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a word. Walter did not look up. He placed a quarter on the pile, then a dime, then 2 nickels. He had done the math in his head already. He had done it before he came to the store, standing in his kitchen with a notepad and a pen, working through the numbers the way he always did. He was short, not by much. He had thought he had more coins than he did, which was a mistake he had made by trusting his memory instead of counting twice, and he recognized the mistake now with the quiet acceptance of a man who had learned to absorb small defeats without drama. He sorted through the remaining coins. There was not enough. Behind him, the whispers were getting louder. "Why doesn't he just use a card?" This from one of the athletic women, not quite under her breath. "Some people," said the suited man, and let the 2 words sit there like a period at the end of a sentence that didn't need finishing. The woman with the toddler pulled her phone out again, and for a moment Walter heard a faint click, the sound of a camera shutter. Something in his chest tightened. Not shame. Exactly. Something older than shame. Something that had been pressed down and carried for so many years that he had forgotten it still had weight until moments like this pulled it up again. He straightened his back slightly. He was not going to rush. He was not going to apologize. He had walked through worse than this. He had walked through things that would make every person in this line go quiet and keep quiet. And this, a crowded checkout lane in a grocery store on a Thursday afternoon, was not going to break the composure that he had built through decades of harder things than this. Emily leaned slightly forward. "Sir," she said, her voice low and genuinely gentle, "I could cover the difference. It's really not a big deal." "Thank you," Walter said. His voice was calm and measured. A voice that had given orders and received orders and survived things neither of those voices could describe. "I'll manage." "It's only a couple of dollars." "I said I'll manage." He said it without sharpness, without anger. He said it the way a man states a fact that is not up for discussion. Emily nodded and stepped back. The line behind Walter had grown to 9 people now. Someone near the back made a comment about self-checkout that drew a quiet laugh from the person next to them. Another person was definitely filming. Walter could hear the faint sound of someone adjusting their phone angle. Then the store manager appeared. His name was Gary Stokes, and he was 46 years old, with the look of a man who had been in retail management long enough to have developed a very specific kind of institutional patience. One that was professional in its surface and quietly exasperated underneath. He approached Register 7 with the measured walk of a man who was trying to look calm while actively wanting the problem to resolve itself. "Good afternoon," he said to Walter, his tone carefully polite. "Is everything all right here?" "Fine," Walter said without looking up. "I just want to make sure if there's an issue with the transaction, we can step aside to the customer service desk and work it out there." Walter's hand paused over the coins. He looked up then. He looked at Gary Stokes with eyes that were dark and steady and very old in the particular way that comes not from age alone, but from having seen things that leave marks behind them. "I'm counting," Walter said. Gary held his smile. "Of course, it's just, there are other customers." "I know," Walter said. "I can hear them." He returned to his coins. Gary stood there for a moment, recalculating his options, and then moved slightly to the side, close enough to maintain a presence, far enough to give the appearance of stepping back. Walter counted the rest. He was short by more than he thought, more than $1 short of the full $16.26. He set the pouch down. He looked at the conveyor belt, at the 6 items he had placed there with care, and then, quietly, with the efficiency of a man who had learned not to waste motion, he began to lift items off the belt and set them to the side. On the box of oatmeal, the can of soup, the butter. He set them aside one by one, each one placed with a deliberateness that made the action feel like something more than it was. Like each item being surrendered was a small decision that cost something. The eggs went next. He picked up the carton, held it for just a moment, and then placed it with the others. What remained on the belt was a single loaf of bread, white, store brand. His hand rested on it briefly before he pulled it toward himself and set it at the edge of the register. "Just the bread," he said. Emily punched it in without a word. Her eyes were bright in a way that she was clearly working to contain. The total came up. $2.19. Walter counted out the exact amount in coins and placed them one by one on the small rubber payment tray. The last coin, a penny, went down. He had been in the army a man who carried other men when they could not carry themselves. He had slept on frozen ground and eaten cold rations and gone without for days at a stretch without complaint, because complaint was a luxury, and he had never been the kind of man who spent what he didn't have. He had shared his food with men who were afraid, and he had eaten less so that they could eat more, and he had told himself then that sacrifice was not the same as loss. But the memory came anyway, unbidden and sharp, the way old memories always came. A clearing somewhere in the dark and the cold. A man bleeding into the mud. The weight of someone else's body across his own shoulders as he moved through chaos with one thought, just one, which was that he was not going to leave this man here. The memory lasted only a second. Then he was back in the store with his one loaf of bread and his empty coin pouch, and the line behind him, and the phone cameras, and Gary Stokes standing off to the side with his managed smile. Emily opened the register drawer and slid the coins in. Walter folded the cloth pouch back into his jacket pocket. He picked up the bread. He was getting ready to leave. It was at that moment that a voice came from the next register over, calm, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of a man who was used to being listened to and never felt the need to speak louder than necessary. "Hold on a moment." The voice belonged to a man who had been standing in the adjacent lane with a handbasket of items and the slightly distracted look of someone who had been paying attention to something else entirely. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, well-built without being imposing, dressed in a dark gray blazer over a simple shirt. Nothing that announced wealth, but nothing that didn't either. His hair was dark with the beginning of gray at the temples, and his face had the composed quality of a man who made decisions for a living. He set his basket down on the belt in his own lane and walked over to Register 7. He addressed Emily directly, not Walter, not the line, not Gary Stokes. "Void that transaction," he said. His voice was quiet and even. Emily blinked. Sorry?" "Void the bread transaction," he said, "and ring up everything he had on the belt." Emily glanced at Gary, who had straightened up considerably. She looked at the bread. She looked at the man. "Ring it all up," the man said again, and reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. And he produced a card, matte black, no logo visible from a distance, and held it out to her. She took it. She voided the bread purchase. She began scanning the items that had been set aside on the small ledge beside the register, the eggs, the butter, the oatmeal, the soup, putting them back through one by one. The register beeped. The new total climbed to $16.26. She ran the card. Approved. No limit notification. No hesitation. Just a quiet green confirmation on the screen and a receipt beginning to print. The entire line had gone silent. Not the restless silence of people waiting, a different kind, a held breath kind. The suited man with his wine bottles had stopped checking his watch. The woman with the toddler had lowered her phone. One of the athletic women had her hand partway over her mouth. Walter Hayes stood at register 7 with his loaf of bread and looked at the man who had just paid for his groceries. His expression was not grateful. It was not relieved. It was something much harder to read, guarded and quiet and watchful, and carrying within it the very specific pride of a man who had spent his whole life refusing to be a burden to anyone. The receipt came out of the printer in the way receipts do, curling slightly at the edges, longer than it seemed like it needed to be. Emily tore it off and held it out toward Walter automatically, which was the habit of someone who had handed thousands of receipts to thousands of people. Walter did not take it right away. He was still looking at the man who had stepped in from the next lane. And the man was looking back at him with an expression that was patient without being pitying. The expression of someone who understood that what had just happened required a moment to settle. The line behind register 7 had gone from restless to quietly riveted. People who had been checking their phones were no longer checking them. The suited man had lowered his wine bottles to his sides. The woman with the toddler was watching from behind the cart with the kind of focused attention that people apply when they sense something significant unfolding, something beyond what it appears to be on the surface. Gary Stokes, the manager, had shifted from his managed calm stance to something stiffer and more alert. He was watching the man in the gray blazer with a new kind of attention now. The assessment of someone trying to determine exactly how much authority was standing in his store. Walter set his loaf of bread down on the counter. He straightened, and the straightening had an effect. He seemed to grow an inch or two from it, the hunch in his shoulders pulling back, the stillness in him becoming more deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was the same voice he had used with Emily, composed, unhurried, and not open to negotiation. "I didn't ask for that," Walter said. "No," the man agreed. "You didn't." "I don't take charity." "I didn't give you charity." The word hung there for a moment. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the careful attention of a man who had learned through long experience that the words people chose when they spoke to him mattered very much. "Then what did you give me?" Walter asked. The man's expression didn't change. "A correction," he said. "What happened here was a mistake. I fixed it." Walter studied him. "A mistake," he repeated. "Yes." "Whose mistake?" The man looked at him for a moment before he answered, and in that pause something shifted, not in the man's expression, but in the quality of his attention, the way it settled on Walter more fully, the way he seemed to be measuring not just the question, but the man asking it. "That's a conversation for somewhere else," he said. Walter was quiet. He was the kind of man who did not fill silence with noise, who could wait without fidgeting and think without showing the thinking on his face. He had learned that stillness in the army when patience was the difference between a good decision and a costly one, and he had carried it with him through everything that came after. Emily slid the bag of groceries across the counter. The bread, the eggs, the milk, the oatmeal, the soup, the butter, all of it bagged neatly, double bagged at the bottom where the jug of milk sat. Walter looked at the bag. He did not pick it up immediately. "What's your name?" Walter asked the man. "Daniel Whitmore." Nothing in Walter's face changed, but something in the store did. The suited man in the line made a sound that was barely audible. A short exhale, the involuntary response of someone who had just registered something significant. One of the athletic women leaned toward the other and whispered something. Gary Stokes went very still. Then recovered himself quickly and began moving toward the register with a completely different energy than the one he'd brought before. Less manager, more person trying to be useful to someone important. Walter either didn't notice or didn't care. He kept his eyes on Daniel. "You're going to tell me that wasn't random," Walter said. "No," Daniel said. "It wasn't." "Then what was it?" Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his blazer again, the same pocket the card had come from, and produced a pen. He looked at Emily. "Can I get that receipt?" Emily glanced between the two men, then handed over the receipt. Daniel flipped it over so the blank side faced up, and he wrote something on the back, 2 lines, clear and deliberate, like a man writing down an address and a time and meaning both precisely. He recapped the pen. He'd held the receipt out to Walter. Walter looked at it without taking it. "Meet me there," Daniel said. "Tomorrow, 11 o'clock? "Why?" "Because what I have to tell you," Daniel said, "takes longer than a checkout line." Walter took the receipt. He held it with the same steadiness with which he had held his coins, not tightly, not loosely, the grip of a man who had learned that the things worth holding required a certain kind of care. He looked at the 2 lines Daniel had written. An address on Carpenter Street, downtown, near the business district. A time. He folded it once, cleanly along the center, and placed it in the front pocket of his jacket. Gary Stokes materialized at Daniel's shoulder with the eager helpfulness of a man who had just recalibrated his understanding of who he was dealing with. "Mr. Whitmore," Gary said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been entirely absent 30 seconds ago. "Is there anything I can help you with? Anything at all? If you'd like to come to the service desk—" "I'm fine," Daniel said, without looking at him. He was still watching Walter. Of course, and I just want to say, whatever you need—" "Thank you," Daniel said in a tone that ended the conversation. Gary stepped back. He did not disappear, but he moved to a respectful distance and stayed there. Walter picked up his bag of groceries. He looked at Daniel once more, the look of a man conducting a final assessment, running the whole of what had just happened through some internal framework that had been built through decades of reading people and situations. "I'll think about it," Walter said. Daniel nodded. "That's all I'm asking." Walter moved toward the exit. The crowd that had formed around Register 7, people from the adjacent lanes, a few who had drifted over from deeper in the store, parted for him instinctively. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just the way a crowd shifts when a person moves through it with enough quiet certainty that the space opens up ahead of them. He walked through the wide glass doors. The little bell chimed. Behind him, the line at Register 7 slowly began to breathe again. The suited man put his wine bottles down on the belt and looked at the person in front of him with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something he was going to be describing to people for the next several days. Emily stood at her register and did not start the next transaction immediately. She was looking at the door. Outside, the air was cold and carried the metallic edge of incoming rain. Walter walked to the bench near the parking lot entrance. Wooden with a metal frame, the kind of bench that sat outside stores so that people could rest while they waited for rides. And he sat down. He set the bag between his feet. He put his hand in his jacket pocket and touched the folded receipt. He did not take it out. Not yet. He just felt it there, the way you might keep your hand near something you weren't sure what to do with, but weren't ready to put down. The cold didn't bother him. He had been cold in places and conditions that made a November afternoon in a grocery store parking lot feel like a mild afternoon in the south of France. And whatever his body had lost over the years in terms of speed and strength, it had not lost its indifference to ordinary discomfort. What it had not lost, either, was its memory. It came without invitation, the way it always came, not as a dream, but as something more immediate than a dream, something with textures and sounds attached to it, the specific sensory weight of a thing that happened. He was younger in the memory, much younger, maybe 26, 27. His body in those years had been a different instrument entirely, sharp and fast, and capable of things that would seem impossible to anyone who had only known him as the man sitting on this bench. There had been a mission. The details of it did not matter now, or rather, they mattered in ways that were too layered to summarize. They were the kind of details that required context that most people did not have the frame of reference to receive. What mattered was the part that stayed with him. A clearing, dark and cold in the way that only certain kinds of cold are, the kind that comes from altitude and exhaustion and the specific despair of a situation that has gone wrong in multiple directions at once. There was noise, and then there was a particular silence that came after noise, and in that silence he heard something. A man, not dead, but not far from it, bleeding into the ground in a way that would make the ground win eventually unless something changed. Walter had made something change. He had moved through the dark and picked the man up and carried him through terrain and chaos and the kind of odds that you don't calculate in the moment, because calculation would tell you to put the man down and save yourself. Well, and Walter had known even then that he was not built for that kind of calculation. He had carried the man because the man was there, and because leaving him was not something that Walter Hayes was capable of doing, not then, not ever. He had not thought of himself as heroic in that moment. He had thought of it as the only available option, the only choice that he could actually make and still be himself afterward. He had not known the man's name. He had not known much about him at all. Rank, unit, not much else. The man had been barely conscious, and the words he managed to say were the kind that people say when they are not sure they are going to make it. Disconnected, urgent, quiet. Walter had told him to stop talking and save his strength. The man had survived. Walter had not known, for a long time, what had happened to him after that. He pulled himself back to the parking lot, the cold, the bag between his feet, the bench with its metal frame. He took the receipt out of his pocket. He unfolded it. He read the address again, Carpenter Street, downtown. He read the time, Daniel Whitmore. He had heard the name. Not well, not in the way that you heard the names of people in your own world, but in the peripheral way that you absorbed the names of people who existed in a different layer of things. Newspaper headlines, business reports, the kind of name that appeared in contexts Walter rarely occupied. A company big enough to have a name that traveled. Whitmore Industries, he thought, though he could not be certain. What he was certain of was this. The man had known his name before they spoke. He had approached the register with intention, not impulse. The receipt with the address had been written with the deliberateness of a man who had planned to write it. This was not charity. Walter was not sure yet what it was. But he was certain it was not charity. He thought about discarding the receipt. The idea came and went quickly, not because he was afraid of whatever Carpenter Street might hold, but because discarding it would be an act of cowardice dressed up as pride, and Walter Hayes had spent his entire life knowing the difference between the two. He folded the receipt back along its crease. He placed it in his jacket pocket, in the inner pocket this time, close to his chest. He picked up the bag of groceries and stood. The rain was beginning, light, fine, barely a mist yet. Not the kind that didn't quite feel like rain until you looked at your jacket and realized it was wet. He started toward the bus stop at the far end of the parking lot. He thought about the man's face, about the word correction, about the way Daniel Whitmore had looked at him, not with pity, not with the particular kind of performance that accompanied most public acts of generosity, but with something that Walter recognized in the way you recognized a thing you hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. The bus stop had a shelter, and Walter stood inside it with his bag and his thoughts, while the mist turned into something more committed. 3 other people waited at the stop. A young woman with earbuds in, an older man reading something on his phone, a teenager with a backpack who was not reading anything and was simply existing in the present moment with the easy totality that only teenagers managed. Walter looked at the street. He was already deciding. Not with certainty. Certainty was a luxury, and he had learned not to mistake the feeling of resolution for the guarantee of outcome. But with the particular quality of intention that a man arrives at when he has lived long enough to know that the choice to walk away from something is still a choice, and that every choice has a shape. He would go to Carpenter Street. He would hear what Daniel Whitmore had to say. And if it turned out to be something Walter could not accept, if it turned out to be charity after all, a dressed-up indifferent language, he would stand up and leave the same way he had left every situation in his life that had asked him to be less than himself. But he would go. The bus came. Walter picked up his bag and stepped on. He showed his pass, moved to a window seat near the back, and settled in. He did not take the receipt out again. He didn't need to. He had already read it twice, and Walter Hayes had never needed to read something 3 times to know what it said. He watched the city move past the window, the stores and the street lights just beginning to flicker on in the early dark of November, the people hunched under umbrellas and hoods, the ordinary machinery of a city evening. He had lived in this city for 31 years. He knew its moods the way you knew the moods of something you had lived alongside long enough to stop being surprised by it. But tonight felt different, not dramatically different, not the kind of different that announced itself, just the quiet, internal kind, the kind where something that has been one shape for a long time begins, without fanfare, to become a different shape, the kind that you only recognize later, looking back, as the moment when things began to change. Walter rode the bus. In his jacket pocket, folded along its crease, the receipt with the address pressed warm against the fabric. The rain had stopped overnight, but the morning held on to the cold the way November always did, stubborn, settling into the bones before you'd even stepped fully out the door. Walter left his apartment at 9:40, which gave him more than enough time to reach Carpenter Street by 11, even accounting for the 2 bus transfers. He wore the same jacket. The flag pin was on the lapel. The veteran's cap was straight on his head. He had slept poorly, not from anxiety exactly, but from the kind of quiet restlessness that comes when your mind is working a problem it doesn't have enough pieces to solve yet. He had lain in the dark and turned the name Daniel Whitmore over the way you turn a coin over, examining both sides, and he had arrived at no particular conclusion except that the man had not felt dishonest. Careful, yes. Deliberate, certainly. But not dishonest. That was something, not everything, but something. And the address on Carpenter Street turned out to be a tower, 40 stories of glass and dark steel, set back from the street behind a wide plaza of granite pavers and low ornamental hedges. There was nothing loud about the building. It announced itself the way certain kinds of power announce themselves, quietly, with the confidence of something that did not need to try. Walter stood on the plaza and looked up at it for a moment. Then he walked toward the entrance. The lobby doors opened before he reached them. 2 security personnel, not the usual bored-looking guards in ill-fitting uniforms, but calm, professional men in dark jackets, stepped forward as he entered, and the taller one said, without hesitation, "Mr. Hayes, good morning. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you." Walter looked at him steadily. "You know my name." "Yes." "Sir." He let that settle. Then he nodded and followed them. The lobby was the kind of space designed to communicate seriousness without ostentation. High ceilings, pale stone floors, a reception desk that curved in a long arc across the far wall. People moved through it with the focused efficiency of a place where everyone had somewhere specific to be. Several of them glanced at Walter as he passed, not rudely, but with the unmistakable quality of people who had been told to expect him and were now adjusting their expectations to the actual man. He was taken to an elevator and then to a floor high enough that the city outside the window looked small and organized, and then down a corridor lined with frosted glass doors, and finally into a boardroom. It was a large room. Long table, high-backed chairs, A wall of windows along one side that looked out over the city. The kind of room where significant decisions got made by people who were comfortable making them. Daniel Whitmore was already there. He was not sitting at the head of the table in the way that men who wanted to demonstrate authority sat at the head of tables. He was standing near the windows in a different blazer than yesterday, charcoal, well-fitted, with his hands loose at his sides. When Walter entered, he turned and extended his hand. Walter shook it. The handshake was firm on both sides. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. "I said I'd think about it," Walter replied. "I thought about it." Something close to a smile crossed Daniel's face. "Sit anywhere you'd like." Walter chose a chair near the middle of the table, not at the far end, not at the head. Daniel sat across from him rather than at the head as well, which Walter noted and filed without comment. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, a gray cloud moved across the face of the sun, and the room dimmed slightly. Daniel reached to the side and brought a folder onto the table. He did not open it immediately. He set it there between them, and then he reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and produced something else entirely. Something smaller and older. A photograph. He placed it on the table and slid it across to Walter. It was black and white, the contrast slightly blown out in the way of photographs taken in difficult conditions with whatever equipment was available, not a studio portrait, but a field photograph, the kind that got taken quickly and survived by accident. 2 soldiers, standing. One of them was holding something, a piece of equipment, a pack, it was hard to tell, and the other had his arm at his side, and they were both looking at the camera with the particular expression of men who were not thinking about the camera at all. Walter picked it up. He looked at the man on the left first. Young, mid-20s, broad through the shoulders, with something in the set of his jaw that Walter recognized before he could identify why he recognized it. He looked at the man on the right. The breath he took was quiet, but deep. He was looking at himself. 50 years ago, but unmistakably himself. The same angle of the head, the same stillness in the posture. "Where did you get this?" Walter asked. "My father kept it," Daniel said. "He kept everything from that period, but this one was in his desk. Not in a box with the rest of the records, in his desk, where he could reach it." Walter's eyes went to the man on the left again. He looked at the jaw, the brow, the way the man held himself. He thought about the night in the clearing. He thought about the weight of another man across his shoulders, and the dark and the cold. "What was his name?" Walter asked, though he was already reaching for it, the name floating somewhere just below the surface of a memory he had pushed aside for decades. "James Whitmore," Daniel said, "Staff Sergeant, 3rd Unit." And there it was. The name came up through everything, through years of deliberate distance from those memories, through the life he had built afterward, through the slow work of becoming someone who lived in the present rather than the past. It came up whole and certain, the way a thing comes up when it was never really gone, only set down somewhere deep. "Jimmy," Walter said almost to himself. His voice was the same even voice it always was, but something under it had shifted. "We called him Jimmy." Daniel nodded. He was watching Walter carefully but without intrusion, the way you watched someone who was handling something fragile and needed the space to do it. Walter set the photograph down on the table. He did not push it back across. He left it in front of him. "He made it," Walter said. It was not quite a question. "He made it," Daniel confirmed. "He lived another 46 years. He had a family. He built a company." A pause. "He talked about you." Walter was quiet for a moment. The cloud outside the windows shifted again, and the room brightened. "He should have been left behind," Walter said. "He knew that," Daniel said. "He spent 46 years knowing it." "I wasn't trying to be a hero." He knew that too. Daniel held his gaze. "He said you never stopped moving, never calculated, just picked him up." Walter looked at the photograph again. Then he looked up at Daniel with an expression that was unreadable to anyone who didn't know how to read it, and what it said, to the person who did, was, "Say what you came to say." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Why did you disappear after the war?" he asked. Walter's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The smallest muscular response, the compression that a man makes when something unexpected touches a nerve he was not prepared for. "I didn't disappear," he said. "I was removed." "Removed," Daniel repeated. "From the record." "Aye, from everything." Walter looked at his hands, then back up. "You have a folder there. I'm guessing it isn't full of my commendations." Daniel opened the folder. He turned it so that the pages faced Walter and slid it across the table. Walter looked down at it without touching it at first. Pages of official documents, typed and stamped, some with signatures, some with redactions in thick black bars. Military records. He recognized the format even after all these years, the particular bureaucratic language of forms designed to make complex human situations fit into small boxes. What the document said, in the accumulated and carefully constructed language of official records, was that Walter Hayes had been discharged under conditions that amounted to a destruction of his reputation and his future, accusations of conduct unbecoming, and of dereliction, of an incident during a mission that had been documented in a way that bore almost no relationship to what had actually happened. "I know what it says," Walter said. "I know you know," Daniel said. "I'm asking you to tell me what's true." Walter sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the clean white ceiling of an expensive boardroom in a building he never would have entered under any ordinary circumstance. And he thought about how many times in 30 years he had been asked to explain himself and had chosen not to, because the people asking were not asking in good faith, and because explaining yourself to someone who has already decided what they believe is a particular kind of exhaustion that he had chosen not to spend himself on. But Daniel Whitmore was not asking in bad faith, and Walter could tell the difference. "I was framed," Walter said. He said it flatly, without drama, the way you state a thing that has been true for so long it no longer needs decoration. "The incident they documented, it happened differently than what's written there. I made a call in the field, the right call. Someone with more rank and more to lose decided the outcome of that call needed a different explanation. I was the explanation." Daniel looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. Walter's eyes sharpened. "How much do you know?" "More than you might expect," Daniel said. "Less than I need. My father started investigating years ago and couldn't finish it. He passed that to me before he died. I've been working on it for 3 years. The weight of that settled over the room. 3 years. Not an impulse. Not a reaction to a grocery store moment. A mission carried forward from a dying man to his son, aimed at something that Walter had long since buried because he had run out of options and energy and the belief that anyone with the power to help was willing to use it. "There's a name," Daniel said. He let a beat pass. "General Richard Caldwell." Walter said nothing, but his hands, resting on the table, went very still. "He's still active," Daniel continued. "Influential, protected by decades of reputation and by the same system that used his version of events to close your case. He is the reason the records say what they say." Walter looked at the folder. At the pages he knew by heart, not because he had read them often. He had in fact made a point of not reading them, but because when something has reshaped your entire life, you carry its shape inside you, whether you look at it directly or not. "What is it you want from me?" Walter asked. "I want to reopen the case," Daniel said. "I have resources, legal counsel, and 3 years of groundwork. What I don't have is you. Your testimony. Your willingness to stand in the center of this and let the truth be told." He held Walter's gaze. "I can't do it without you." Walter was quiet for a long time. Outside the windows, the city moved in its ordinary way. Traffic, movement, the small, indifferent machinery of a day in progress. Inside the boardroom, neither man moved. Daniel waited. He had the quality, Walter was noticing, of a man who had learned to wait without filling the silence, without adding to it, without prompting, without performing patience. He simply waited, and the waiting was genuine. Walter looked at the documents in the folder. He looked at the photograph still resting in front of him. He thought about his apartment, the 2 rooms of it, the window that looked out onto the back of another building, the pension that was not a pension because his discharge had stripped it, and the VA benefits that were not his because the record said he had not earned them, and the 31 years of living in the narrow space between what he had been and what the paperwork said he was. He thought about the store yesterday, the coins, the line of people, the phone cameras. He thought about Jimmy Whitmore bleeding into a clearing 50 years ago and the fact that he had not left him there. "You said Caldwell is protected," Walter said. "He is. And you think you can break through that?" "I think we can," Daniel said. "Not easily. Not without risk, but yes." What kind of risk? Daniel did not minimize it. The kind that comes with threatening a powerful man's legacy. He will respond. He already has resources working against us. I've seen early signs of that. Witnesses may be pressured. Information may be suppressed again. There may be attempts to discredit you publicly before we can establish the truth. He held Walter's gaze. "I want you to know exactly what this is before you decide." Walter appreciated that. He appreciated it the way a man appreciated being spoken to honestly in a world that had spent most of his life being dishonest with him. "What do you have?" Walter asked. "Specifically." Daniel reached back into the folder and pulled out a second set of pages. Inconsistencies in the original field reports that don't align with independent records from the same date. Testimony from 2 former soldiers who were present and have given informal accounts that contradict the official narrative. And a former Army investigator who reviewed the case 10 years ago and found procedural irregularities significant enough to document, but was told to close the file. "That's not enough," Walter said. "Not yet," Daniel agreed. "There's a witness we haven't located yet. Someone who was closer to the situation than anyone else, and who we believe has been deliberately kept quiet. Finding him is the next step." Walter looked at the table. He thought about the word deliberately. He thought about the reach that word implied, the kind of power that could keep a man quiet for decades, not by threatening him directly, but by making the world around him small enough that speaking up felt impossible. He thought about what it meant that he was sitting in this room at all. "I was left with nothing," Walter said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement, delivered the way he delivered all his statements, evenly, with neither self-pity nor performance. "My record, my benefits, the years I put in, the people I served with who stopped knowing me because the paperwork said I wasn't who they'd thought I was." He paused. "I built something else. It's not much to look at, but it's mine, and it's honest, and I haven't asked anyone for anything I didn't earn." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "And you're asking me to go back into all of it, to stand in the middle of something that will pull all of that up again in public, with a man like Caldwell on the other side who has every reason to make it worse." "Yes," Daniel said. "That's what I'm asking." Walter folded his hands on the table. "Your father," Walter said. "He really spent years on this?" "From the time he was well enough to work a phone and a file cabinet until he wasn't anymore," Daniel said. "He said he owed you. He said—" Daniel stopped for a moment, and in that moment Walter saw something cross his face that was not boardroom composure, but something more personal, more costly. "He said that a man who saves your life with no thought for his own deserves to have someone do the same." The room was very quiet. Walter unfolded his hands. He placed them flat on the table. He looked at the photograph one more time, the two young soldiers, the field behind them, with the quality of the light that only exists in places where the ordinary rules of safety have been suspended. "All right," he said. Daniel looked at him. "All right," Walter said again. "We do this." Daniel nodded slowly. "There are things I need to tell you, things that are going to get harder before they get easier." "They usually do," Walter said. Daniel pulled the folder back toward him and began to walk Walter through it. The full scope of what he had uncovered, what he suspected, what remained to be found. He spoke carefully and completely, the way a man speaks when he is giving another man the entire picture rather than the version that would be easiest to hear. The official story, Daniel explained, had been assembled with precision. It was not a hasty cover-up, but a constructed narrative, built deliberately, with the authority of someone who knew exactly how military record-keeping worked and how to shape it. The incident during the mission had been real. The choices made in the field had been real. What had not been real was the sequence of events as recorded, the attribution of decisions that had been made by someone with more rank to someone with less, and the selective omission of context that would have made Walter's actions not only defensible, but exemplary. Caldwell had been the senior officer on that operation. The operation had gone wrong, not because of anything Walter had done, but because of a series of decisions made at command level that Caldwell had made, and that had resulted in a situation that required unofficial explanations. Walter had been in the wrong place at the right time, which in this context meant he was present enough to be credible as an explanation, and junior enough to be expendable. "He didn't know you personally," Daniel said. "You weren't targeted because of who you were. You were targeted because of where you were." Walter absorbed this. "That doesn't make it better," he said. "No," Daniel said, "it doesn't." The weight of it was not new. Walter had carried the shape of this story for 30 years without the details, because the shape of it was something a man could feel even when he couldn't prove it. What was new was the confirmation, the specificity, the feeling of a thing that had been a suspicion becoming a fact. "Caldwell knew my father saved your life," Daniel said. "He knew there was a connection. I think that's part of why the case was never quietly revisited. He was always watching for someone to come back to it." "And now someone has," Walter said. "And now someone has," Daniel confirmed. It was late morning, moving toward noon. The city outside the windows was bright now, the cloud cover thinner, light coming through in a way that made the boardroom feel less sealed off from the world. Daniel poured water from a carafe on the table, and Walter drank it. "There will be pressure on you," Daniel said. "Not just legal pressure, personal. He'll look for ways to make you doubt whether continuing is worth it. He'll look for vulnerabilities." "He'll have a hard time finding ones he hasn't already used," Walter said. "There may be people who come to you, people who seem sympathetic, but aren't. People looking for information about our strategy." "I've dealt with that kind of person," Walter said. Daniel looked at him. "I know you have." He paused. "I want you to know that the resources I've committed to this, legal, financial, investigative, are real, and they're yours for the duration. I'm not asking you to fight this with what you have. I'm asking you to fight it with what we have together." Walter considered this. "There's a line," he said, "between fighting together and being kept." "I know where that line is," Daniel said. "Make sure you do." "I will." Walter looked at the photograph one more time. Then he pushed it back across the table toward Daniel. Not dismissively, but deliberately. The way you return something to someone who has been carrying it for a long time and will need it for what comes next. "The witness you haven't found yet," Walter said. "Yes." "I might know who it is," Walter said. "There was a man in my unit. He was close enough to see everything. He disappeared not long after the discharge was finalized. I always thought—" He stopped, reorganized. "I always thought he'd been convinced to go quiet. He wasn't a bad man. He just wasn't built for what standing up would have cost him." A name. "Leon," Walter said. "Leon Briggs." Daniel wrote it down. Somewhere in the building below them, in an office Walter had never seen, through channels Walter did not know, involving the activation of the kind of resources that Walter had never in his life had access to, the name Leon Briggs began to move through a network built to find things and people that had been deliberately made hard to find. And somewhere else entirely, in a wood-paneled office with a view of a different city, behind a desk that held awards and citations and the curated artifacts of a decorated career, a phone rang. The man who answered it listened for a moment. His expression did not change. He set the phone down slowly, with the care of a man who had learned over a long career that the appearance of control was itself a form of control. Then he reached for a different phone. Walter Hayes had surfaced, and he was not alone. The morning after Walter agreed to move forward, Daniel's legal team began filing the paperwork to formally reopen the case. By noon, 3 things had already gone wrong. The first was that a set of supplemental field reports from the original operation, documents that Daniel's investigator had confirmed were accessible in the military archives 2 weeks prior, were now listed as restricted pending interagency review. No explanation, no timeline, just a status change that had appeared overnight as quietly and precisely as a lock being turned from the inside. The second was a phone call to Daniel's lead attorney from a former colleague. Friendly, casual, the kind of call that disguised its purpose in small talk before arriving at its actual point, which was a suggestion, gently worded, that this particular case might be more complicated than it appeared, and that there were people who felt strongly that old records were best left undisturbed. The third was that 2 individuals who had previously agreed to provide informal supporting statements stopped returning calls entirely. Daniel reviewed all 3 developments by early afternoon. He did not appear rattled by them. He appeared, if anything, more focused, the way certain people respond to resistance by becoming quieter and more deliberate, rather than louder and more reactive. He called Walter that evening and told him what had happened without softening any of it. Walter listened. "How fast?" he asked. 12 hours from when we filed," Daniel said. "That's not a coincidence." "No," Daniel said, "it isn't. Caldwell has someone watching the filing systems, possibly more than one person." Walter thought about this. He had spent decades being a man with very little institutional reach, and in that time he had developed a precise understanding of what institutional reach actually looked like when it was being used against you. It looked exactly like this, not dramatic, not visible, just quietly effective. Doors closing without a sound, phones going unanswered, records developing sudden complications. "What's his name again?" Walter said. "The witness." "Leon Briggs. We're looking." "He'll be hard to find," Walter said. "If he went quiet the way I think he did, he went quiet all the way, changed his pattern, moved somewhere small." "We have people who find people who don't want to be found," Daniel said. "Give us a few days." Walter gave them the few days. During those days, Emily Hartwell was doing something that nobody had asked her to do. She had thought about the moment at Register 7 more than she expected to, more than made practical sense, really, for something that had lasted maybe 15 minutes and involved a customer she had never seen before and would likely never see again. But something about it had not released its grip on her. The quiet steadiness of the old man with his coins, the controlled way he had removed items from the belt, the moment when his hand had rested on the bread. She had looked up the name Walter Hayes the evening after it happened, more out of instinct than intention, and what she had found was a small tangle of conflicting information that didn't resolve itself into a clear picture. There were old records, a military discharge that didn't match the kind of man she had watched stand at her register with a veteran's cap and a flag pin, and the absolute composure of someone who had been through far harder things than a grocery store line. She had written his name on a piece of paper. She had kept the paper. 3 days after the store incident, she used her lunch break to visit the local VA office and ask, as carefully and non-intrusively as she could manage, whether there were records she could access as a private citizen. There were not. But the woman at the desk, who had the particular empathy of someone who had spent years watching veterans navigate a system that was not always built for them, suggested that public library archives sometimes held local military history records and newspaper files going back decades. Emily went to the library after her shift. She did not find everything, but she found enough to confirm that the conflicting information was not a glitch or an error. It was a contradiction, and contradictions of that particular kind, in her limited but instinct-guided understanding, did not usually arise by accident. She wrote more notes. She kept those too. On the 4th day after Walter had agreed to fight, Daniel's team found Leon Briggs. He was living in a small town in eastern Tennessee, a place of maybe 3,000 people, with a diner and a post office and the kind of quiet that you chose deliberately rather than arrived at accidentally. He was 68 years old, in reasonable health, and living under a name that was his middle name combined with his mother's maiden name, not a complete alias. But enough of a shift to make casual searches produce nothing. He had a small house at the end of a gravel road with a garden that had been tended carefully through the season, and a dog that barked once when the car pulled up and then went silent. Daniel flew down himself. He brought his lead attorney. He did not bring Walter, which was a deliberate decision. Arriving with the man whose name was at the center of everything might close Leon down before a word was spoken. Leon Briggs answered the door in a flannel shirt and old work pants, and he looked at Daniel with the expression of a man who had been expecting someone to knock on this particular door for a very long time, and had spent that time going back and forth between hoping they would and hoping they wouldn't. "I figured this was coming," Leon said. "Yeah, when I heard someone was reopening it." "How did you hear?" Daniel asked. Leon looked at him evenly. "Word moves, even to places like this." He opened the door wider. "Come in?" They sat in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and old wood, and Leon Briggs talked for 2.5 hours. He talked about the operation, about what he had seen, and where he had been positioned, and what the sequence of events had actually been on the ground. Not the version in the official report, but the one that he had lived through and carried ever since. He talked about the morning after, when he had been called in by officers he didn't know and told, in language that was technically never threatening but was always threatening, that the situation was complex and sensitive, and that what he thought he remembered might not be what he actually remembered. While he had been 24 years old, he had a young wife at home. He had been told, without being told, that speaking up would cost him things he could not afford to lose. "I've thought about Walter Hayes every year since then," Leon said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that required maintenance. "Every year, what I did, what I didn't do." "You can do something now," Daniel said. Leon looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked back at Daniel. "Caldwell's people have already called me," Leon said. 2 days ago. Someone who said they were doing a routine records review, but the questions they asked—" He shook his head. "We can protect you," Daniel said. "I know you'll try," Leon said. And then, after a pause, "I'll testify." What Leon's testimony introduced, beyond the direct contradiction of the official record, was something that changed the shape of the entire case. The incident that Walter had been blamed for was not, as the record suggested, a failure of judgment or a betrayal of duty. It had been part of a covert operational branch that had gone badly wrong. Caldwell had authorized actions that exceeded his sanctioned authority. When the outcome became something that required explanation, he had used the reporting structure under his command to redirect the official account, not just away from himself, but toward Walter, who had been present, who had been visible, and who had no rank and no leverage and no one above him willing to push back. Leon had been present. Leon had seen it. And Leon had been 24 years old with a young wife at home. He sacrificed Walter to protect himself, Leon said, and then he built a career on the story he told about it. Daniel arranged security for Leon that evening. He called Walter. Walter listened to the summary in silence. When Daniel finished, Walter said, "I knew it was him. I knew the shape of it. I just couldn't prove it." "We're proving it now," Daniel said. "Is it enough?" "With Leon's testimony and what we have already, it's enough to force a formal hearing. But Caldwell will move. He'll try to discredit Leon, and he'll try to put pressure on anyone adjacent to our case." "Then we move faster than he does," Walter said. Daniel filed for the formal hearing 2 days later. By the next morning, it had been picked up by 2 news outlets. By the evening, it was on 4. The story, when it broke into public view, did not break cleanly. It came out in fragments, the way stories about the past always came out, because the past was rarely a single clean narrative, and the people with stakes in it rarely allowed it to be told in the most straightforward order. One outlet led with Walter, the veteran, the grocery store moment, the coins, the bread, and framed it as a story of quiet dignity meeting unlikely justice. Another outlet led with the military records and the question of a cover-up, and kept the framing cautious and conditional, full of phrases like alleged misconduct and conflicting accounts, and a case that raises questions. A third outlet led with Caldwell. His photograph, a formal portrait, decorated uniform, the posture of a man entirely comfortable being photographed in full authority, appeared alongside a brief statement from his office confirming that General Caldwell had full confidence in the integrity of the original findings and considered the reopening of the case a politically motivated attempt to undermine a distinguished career. The statement was measured, professional, and it was released within 6 hours of the first news report appearing, which told Daniel everything he needed to know about how closely Caldwell's team had been watching. Walter watched the coverage from his apartment. He watched it on the small television in his kitchen, the sound turned low, sitting at the table where he had eaten breakfast every morning for 31 years. He watched his own name move across the bottom of the screen in the scrolling text that news channels used to indicate that something was currently happening and was considered significant enough to interrupt the ordinary flow of information. He did not find it comfortable. He had not expected to find it comfortable. He had known from the moment he said all right in that boardroom that this was what coming forward looked like. Not a private act of reclamation, but a public one with all the exposure and vulnerability that public things carried. He was not going to run from it, but he allowed himself, in the privacy of his kitchen, to feel the full weight of what it meant to have the story of his worst years become the kind of thing that scrolled across the bottom of television screens. Daniel called that evening. He also had news about Emily. Emily Hartwell had, on her own initiative, contacted Daniel's office 2 days after the case became public. She had asked, carefully and somewhat apologetically, whether her account of what she had witnessed in the store would be of any use to anyone. She was not, she clarified, certain that it was relevant to a military case from 50 years ago. She just felt that she had seen something important and that keeping it to herself was not the right thing to do. Daniel had taken the call personally. What Emily could offer was not legal evidence about Caldwell or the operation or the official records. What she could offer was witness testimony about the character and circumstance of the man at the center of the case, an elderly veteran, alone, counting coins at a register, who had declined charity with dignity and had stood his ground without raising his voice in a situation designed to make him feel small. It was not a detail that proved a military cover-up, but it was a detail that established who Walter Hayes was in the present. And in a case where Caldwell's strategy was to paint Walter as an unreliable narrator of his own history, a credible contemporary account of his character mattered more than it might have in a purely legal context. "I want to speak with her," Walter said. "I thought you might," Daniel said. Emily came to the building on Carpenter Street 2 days later. She wore a good coat and carried a folder of the notes she had made. Neatly organized, a little anxious, entirely genuine. She sat across from Walter in a smaller room than the boardroom, a meeting room with a low table and chairs that didn't try to impress anyone. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," she said. "I'm just a cashier." "You were the only person in that store who offered to help me," Walter said. Emily looked at him. "You said no." "I did," Walter said, "but you offered. That's different from not noticing." Something in her expression settled. "I've been looking into your case," she said. "On my own. I'm not a lawyer or a researcher or anything, but I found some things in the library that didn't add up." Walter looked at the folder in her hands. "What kind of things?" She opened it and slid a page across the table. A photocopy of a newspaper article from decades ago, local coverage of military honors in the region, a brief mention of Walter's name in a context that directly contradicted the narrative of the discharge records. His name in print associated not with misconduct, but with commendation. A reference to actions in the field, a ceremony that had apparently taken place before the subsequent machinery of the official story had come into effect and retroactively rewritten the record. Walter looked at it for a long moment. "I never saw this," he said quietly. "It was in the archive," Emily said. "I almost missed it. It was filed under a general military category, not under your name." She paused. "I think if someone had looked, they would have found it, but I don't think anyone looked." Walter slid the article back to her. "Keep that," he said. "Give it to Daniel's team." She nodded. She looked at him with the careful directness of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "Why didn't you fight it back then?" she asked, and then immediately, "I'm sorry. That's probably—" "It's a fair question," Walter said. "Because I was 28 years old and I had no money and no one who believed me and no clear path through a system that had already decided what the truth was." He paused. "And because at a certain point you stop spending what you don't have and you start building with what you do." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to help, whatever I can do." Meanwhile, Leon Briggs had received a second contact. Not a phone call this time, but a visit. 2 men, neither of whom identified themselves clearly, had appeared at the end of his gravel road in a car with no markings and asked questions that they framed as routine, but that targeted the specific details of the testimony he had given Daniel's team. Daniel's security personnel had documented the visit. It was now part of the file. Inside Whitmore Industries, something else was happening that Daniel had not yet shared with Walter. One of his senior executives, a man named Patrick Holloway, who had been with the company for 11 years and who had sat in on 2 of the early strategy meetings about the case, had been identified as the source of a leak. Specific details of the legal approach, the timeline of filings, and the existence of Leon Briggs as a witness had reached Caldwell's legal team before they should have been reachable. Daniel had confronted Holloway directly. The conversation had been brief. Holloway had been removed from the company before the day was out, and the specific information he had provided was now factored into Daniel's revised strategy, which meant deliberately feeding certain channels with adjusted details to identify whether there were additional leaks. Caldwell's reach was longer than expected. But the morning before the formal hearing, Emily found something she had not been looking for. She had been reviewing archived records at the library for the 3rd time. going back through materials she had already looked at, because she had learned from her first 2 sessions that the thing you missed was usually the thing sitting just beside the thing you were looking at. She had been moving through a collection of administrative military correspondence from the relevant period. He cross-referencing dates with the timeline Daniel's team had established. And she found it. Not the missing evidence itself, not the original document that had been removed from the official archives, but a copy. A carbon copy, the kind made routinely in that era as a matter of bureaucratic habit, filed not in the military section, but in a regional government records collection that shared physical archive space, stored under an administrative heading that bore no obvious relationship to anything military. Someone had filed it in the wrong place. Or possibly, Emily thought, looking at it carefully under the archive room's fluorescent lights, someone had filed it in exactly the right place for it to be invisible to anyone who knew what they were looking for, but not to anyone who didn't know to look at all. The document showed alterations. Specific sections of the original field report had been modified. Dates shifted. Attributions changed. A key sequence of events reordered in a way that moved responsibility from one rank to another. And in the margin of the carbon copy, in handwriting that was different from the typed body of the document, there was a notation, a name, a date, and a signature. She photographed it carefully with her phone. She photographed it from 3 angles. She sent the photographs to Daniel's private number with a message that said only, "I think I found it. Library Archive, Regional Government Section. Please call me." Daniel called within 4 minutes. He looked at the photographs. He sent them immediately to his legal team. His lead attorney called back within the hour with a single sentence that carried the weight of everything they had been building toward. "This is enough. This directly implicates Caldwell. We take this into the hearing tomorrow, and the trajectory of this changes completely." Daniel sat in his office for a moment after the call ended. He thought about his father, about a man who had spent the last years of his life working toward exactly this. A piece of paper, filed in the wrong place, found by a young woman who had been paying attention in a grocery store checkout line when most people were checking their phones. He picked up his phone and called Walter. Walter picked up on the second ring. "Emily found something," Daniel said. "Something significant." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then, "How significant?" "Significant enough," Daniel said, "that tomorrow is going to be different than Caldwell expects." Walter looked out the window of his apartment, at the back of the other building, at the narrow strip of evening sky visible between them. He thought about a clearing in the dark 50 years ago, about the weight of another man across his shoulders, about the choice that had felt, in the moment, like the only possible choice. "Then we're ready," Walter said. The courthouse was older than most of the buildings around it. Red brick, wide steps, the kind of architecture that had been built to communicate permanence. It sat on a corner of the downtown district where the streets were still wide and the trees had been growing long enough to reach the second-floor windows. On the morning of the hearing, the steps were already lined with people by the time Walter arrived. Not a crowd exactly, but more than a hearing of this kind would ordinarily draw. There were reporters with cameras positioned at the base of the steps. There were veterans, some in caps like Walter's, some in jackets with insignia on the breast, who had come without being asked, drawn by the particular gravity of a case that had implications beyond one man's record. There were ordinary people, too, faces Walter did not recognize, who had followed the story through the news and had decided that showing up was the right thing to do. Walter saw none of them the way a man sees things he is not prepared for. He saw them the way he had learned to see everything in his life that carried weight, steadily, fully, without flinching. He was wearing the navy jacket, the flag pin, with the cap straight on his head. Daniel walked beside him up the steps, and beside Daniel walked the lead attorney, a woman named Claire Ashford, who moved with the focused economy of someone who had argued important cases before and understood that preparation was the only thing that mattered in the next few hours. Emily walked a step behind them. She had worn a dark blazer and carried her folder of notes pressed against her side, and she looked like someone who understood that what she was doing mattered and was going to do it carefully. The courtroom inside was formal and high-ceilinged, the wood paneling on the walls, the dark brown of something that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations. The gallery filled quickly. Journalists, legal observers, veterans advocates, and members of the public who had been granted seats in the limited gallery space. The sound of the room before proceedings began was the particular murmur of a large number of people trying to be quiet and not quite achieving it. Richard Caldwell entered from the side with his legal team. He was 71 years old, and he looked like a man who had never once in his life been asked to account for himself in a room that wasn't under his control. He was tall, still straight-backed, with gray hair cut close and the particular bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his word was final. His suit was dark. His expression was composed in a way that suggested composure was his natural state, and not something he was working to maintain. He sat at the respondent's table without looking toward Walter. Walter looked at him. And he looked at him the way he had looked at every difficult thing in his life, directly, without performance, with the steady attention of a man who had decided that looking away was not available to him. The presiding judge was a woman in her late 50s named Judge Patricia Weston, known in legal circles for a combination of precision and impatience with anything that wasted her time. She entered, the room rose, she sat, and the hearing began. Claire Ashford opened for Walter's side with a statement that was concise and without rhetorical excess. She laid out the case in plain language. A decorated soldier had been wrongfully blamed for the failures of a superior officer. The record had been deliberately altered to serve the interests of that officer's career. The man who had been harmed had spent 50 years living with the consequences, while the man responsible had continued to benefit from the lie. She did not use inflammatory language. She did not need to. The facts, presented in sequence, carried their own weight. Caldwell's legal team countered with a reframing that was polished and experienced. The lead attorney, a man named Douglas Firth, who had the smooth certainty of someone accustomed to winning, argued that the original findings had been thorough and procedurally sound, that memories from 5 decades ago were inherently unreliable, and that what was being presented as new evidence was in fact a selective reinterpretation of incomplete records, driven by the financial and personal interests of a billionaire with a family grievance. He said the word grievance with a particular shading that was meant to reduce everything Daniel Whitmore had done to the category of emotion rather than evidence. Walter noticed this. He filed it away. When the time came for Walter to take the stand, the room went very still. He walked to the witness stand with the same walk he had used his entire life. Unhurried, level, the walk of a man who knew where he was going and was not going to be rushed getting there. He sat. He looked at Claire Ashford. He waited. She asked him to describe, in his own words, what had happened on the day in question during the operation. Walter spoke for 22 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He did not consult notes. He described the operation from the beginning, the objective, the positioning, the sequence of events on the ground as he had experienced them. He described the moment when the operation began to go wrong and what he had observed in terms of the orders being given and by whom. He described his own actions, what he had done and why, the reasoning behind each decision made in real time under conditions that did not allow for extended deliberation. He described the aftermath and the morning that followed and the process by which he had been called in and told what his version of events would be. He spoke without bitterness, without performance. He spoke the way a man speaks when he is simply telling the truth, and the truth is sufficient. There was no sound from the gallery while he spoke, not a cough, not a shifted seat. The journalists had their pens moving. The veterans sitting in the gallery rows were watching him with an expression that was not pity and not outrage, but something more specific: recognition. The recognition of people who understood the particular texture of what he was describing, who knew from experience the way a military system could turn on one of its own when one of its own became inconvenient. When Douglas Firth stood to cross-examine, he was careful. He did not make the mistake of attacking Walter directly. The optics of that were too obvious, and Judge Weston was watching with the sharp attention of someone who did not miss obvious mistakes. Instead, he worked around the edges, questioning the specificity of memory across 5 decades. Introducing the idea of conflation, the natural human tendency to reconstruct the past in ways that aligned with the present emotional state. Walter answered each question with the same even patience he had brought to the stand. He did not become rattled. He did not take the bait of any question that was designed to produce an emotional rather than factual response. When Firth suggested that Walter's recollection might be influenced by what he had been told by Daniel Whitmore's team in the weeks prior, Walter looked at him calmly and said, "What I told them is what I'm telling you now. I told them first." Several people in the gallery reacted to that. Judge Weston did not, but something in her expression indicated that she had registered it. Leon Briggs took the stand in the early afternoon. He was not a polished witness. He fidgeted slightly in the chair, and his voice had a roughness to it that came not from nerves, but from the particular effort of a man saying something he had carried too long in silence. That roughness, paradoxically, made him more credible. This was not testimony that had been rehearsed into smoothness. This was a man arriving at the truth by force of will after decades of looking the other way. He described what he had seen with specificity that matched and reinforced Walter's account at every point that mattered. He described the orders that had been given, and by whom. He described the sequence that the official record had reversed. He described the morning after, the visit from officers he didn't know, the conversation that had been technically never threatening but always threatening, and the choice he had made that he had not stopped regretting since. "I told myself I was protecting my family," Leon said. He looked at his hands. "I was protecting myself. I need to say that clearly." Douglas Firth's cross-examination of Leon was more aggressive than it had been with Walter. He challenged the reliability of Leon's memory, raised the matter of the name change, suggested that a man who had chosen to live under an altered identity might have other reasons for concealing things, and implied that Leon's testimony was a transaction, something exchanged for protection and resources from Whitmore Industries. Leon looked at him steadily when the implication landed. "Nobody bought my testimony," Leon said. "I had to be found. I didn't come forward. I wish I had years ago." That's not the behavior of someone looking for a transaction. Firth moved on quickly. The evidence arrived in the late afternoon. Claire Ashford standing before the court with the carbon copy that Emily had found in the regional archive, presenting it as Exhibit 17 in a sequence that had been building methodically all day. She walked the court through the document carefully, the dates, the alterations, the reordering of the event sequence, and finally the marginal notation, the handwritten name, the date, and the signature. The signature was Richard Caldwell's. The courtroom did not erupt. It was not that kind of moment. What happened instead was a kind of collective intake of breath, the sound of a large number of people absorbing something that changed the shape of everything they had been listening to for the past several hours. Caldwell's composure, which had been absolute throughout the day, underwent a change that was small but visible, a tightening around the jaw, a shift in the set of his shoulders, not a collapse, but a compression, as if something inside him had drawn in slightly against a pressure he had not expected to feel. Judge Weston looked at the document for a long time. She asked Douglas Firth if he wished to respond to the exhibit. Firth requested a recess, which was granted. During the recess, Walter sat in a side room with Daniel and Claire and Emily. He held a paper cup of coffee and said very little. Now Emily sat across from him with her folder on her knees, and at one point she said quietly, "That document, I found it by accident. I almost didn't look at that section at all." "That's how things get found," Walter said, "by the person who doesn't know they shouldn't be looking." When the hearing resumed, Firth did not have a response to the exhibit that held. He offered procedural objections regarding chain of custody and archive classification, both of which Claire addressed efficiently, and which Judge Weston did not appear to find persuasive. Caldwell was asked to take the stand. He did so with maintained composure. But the composure now had a different quality. It was the composure of a man holding a position rather than the composure of a man who had no reason to worry about losing one. His answers to Claire's questions were careful to the point of evasion, and several times Judge Weston asked him to respond to the specific question rather than the question adjacent to it. When Claire asked him directly about the marginal notation, his name, his handwriting, his signature, Caldwell said he could not confirm that the document was authentic. Claire had a handwriting analyst's report, filed as Exhibit 18, that confirmed it. Caldwell said that the context of the notation required fuller explanation than a hearing of this kind could accommodate. Claire noted that the hearing had been running for 7 hours and that the court had ample time. The crack in Caldwell's image was not dramatic. It was not a moment of collapse or confession or visible shame. It was simply this. For the first time in decades, Richard Caldwell was in a room where his word was not final, and the room knew it, and he knew the room knew it, and the knowledge of that moved across his face like something passing behind a window, visible for just a moment before the curtain came down again. Judge Weston announced that she had sufficient material to review and that her decision would be issued within 72 hours. The hearing closed. Walter walked down the courthouse steps in the late afternoon light, golden, long-shadowed, the particular light of a day that has been long and has arrived at something. The reporters were still there. Several of them called his name. He did not stop, but he did not hurry either. He moved through the light with the same walk he had always had, and beside him were Daniel and Emily and Leon. And the veterans who had come to the steps that morning had waited, and a few of them raised a hand as he passed, and Walter raised one back. He did not know yet what the judge would decide. But he knew something else, something that did not depend on the judge's decision, or Caldwell's exposure, or the formal machinery of justice doing what it was supposed to do. He knew that the truth had been said, out loud, in a room that was required to listen to it. He knew that he had told it himself, in his own voice, with his own words, and that the telling could not be undone. For a man who had spent 50 years carrying a version of himself that someone else had written, that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. The 72 hours that Judge Weston had asked for became 58. Walter was in his kitchen, the same table, I at the same window looking onto the back of the other building, the same narrow strip of sky, when Daniel called with the news. It was early morning, gray and cold outside, the last week of November pressing down on the city with the particular weight of a season that had made up its mind. "She ruled in your favor," Daniel said. "Full overturn. The original findings are vacated. The record is to be corrected." Walter held the phone against his ear and looked at the window. He did not say anything for a moment, not because he had nothing to say, but because some things arrived with a weight that required a moment to be received properly, not deflected, not minimized, not rushed past, but actually received. "All of it?" he said. "All of it," Daniel said. "Your discharge status, the misconduct findings. The record as it stands, all of it overturned. And the ruling includes language about the deliberate nature of the original alterations. She didn't call it a cover-up in legal terms, but she called it what it was." Walter looked at his hands on the table. He thought about the morning, decades ago, when the other version of the record had become official. He had been in a room not unlike a courtroom, smaller, less formal, but carrying the same quality of finality. He had been told what his life was going to look like from that point forward, and he had walked out of that room into a world that had rearranged itself around the lie, and he had spent 30 years building something inside the shape that the lie allowed. And now the shape was different. "What happens to Caldwell?" Walter asked. "The ruling has been referred to the Department of Defense's Inspector General," Daniel said. "The Attorney General's office has opened a preliminary inquiry. It's not a guaranteed outcome. These things take time and there are layers, but the ruling creates a formal record that makes it significantly harder to look away." "He'll have lawyers," Walter said. "He will," Daniel agreed, "but he won't have the story anymore." Walter thought about this. The story, the constructed, carefully maintained story that had served Caldwell for 50 years, was gone. Not quietly buried somewhere, but dismantled in a courtroom in front of journalists and veterans and a judge who had put her findings in writing. Whatever the legal process produced from here, the story was finished. It was not the same as justice. Walter knew the difference. But it was something real, and he was not going to refuse it, because it wasn't everything. "Thank you, Daniel," he said. "My father would have wanted to make that call himself," Daniel said. His voice was steady, but the steadiness required something. "I'm glad I got to make it." The public response to the ruling was immediate and significant. The news coverage that had been divided and cautious became, after the ruling, considerably less so. The outlets that had hedged their framing moved toward clarity. Veterans organizations released statements. Several members of Congress issued comments that called for a formal review of similar cases from the same era. Acknowledgement that what had happened to Walter Hayes might not have happened only to Walter Hayes. G. Caldwell's formal portrait, the one that had appeared beside his measured public statement a week earlier, appeared again in coverage, but now beside the text of Judge Weston's ruling, which included language precise enough that it was being quoted in full in some reports. His office did not issue a new statement. The absence of a statement was its own kind of statement. Within a week of the ruling, the Department of Defense formally corrected Walter's military record. It was a bureaucratic process. Forms, official channels, the administrative machinery of a large institution making an adjustment to its own documentation. And it was also, in its quiet way, a complete reversal of 50 years of official reality. His discharge status was changed. The misconduct findings were expunged. And with those corrections came the restoration of benefits that Walter had been denied for decades: a full military pension, health care access, and a lump sum back payment that, while it could not return the years, returned something of what those years had cost. Walter sat with the paperwork for a long time before he signed it. He read every page carefully, the way he had always read things that mattered, not quickly, not assuming, but line by line with the particular attention of a man who had learned never to accept what something said at first glance. When he signed, he did it with the pen that had been in the drawer of his kitchen table for as long as he could remember. An ordinary pen. He did not look for a different one. The ceremony was Daniel's idea, though he presented it as something that others had asked for. It was held at a Veterans Community Center on a Saturday afternoon in early December, a room with folding chairs and long tables pushed to the sides and a small podium near the far wall. It was not a formal military ceremony. Walter had been asked if he wanted one and had declined, which surprised no one who had met him. What it was, instead, was a room full of people who had found their way to this story from different directions and had decided to show up. Leon Briggs came from Tennessee. He wore a collared shirt and sat in the third row and shook Walter's hand before the ceremony began with the grip of a man saying something that a handshake could carry, but words had a harder time with. Walter held the grip for a moment. He looked at Leon and said nothing, and Leon said nothing, and the nothing they said was complete. Emily came with her mother, who had heard the story in the incremental way that family members hear about things their children are involved in, a detail at a time, over phone calls, until the full shape of it became visible. Emily sat in the second row and held her folder on her lap, still, after everything, keeping her notes. There were veterans from the community who had not known Walter before any of this, but who had followed the case and felt its implications in the way that people feel the implications of things that involve their own history. Some of them were old, some of them were much younger, the children and grandchildren of people from Walter's era, for whom this story carried a different kind of weight. Daniel stood near the back of the room. He had helped organize the space, arranged for the catering, but ensured that the logistics worked. When people asked whether he wanted to speak, he said he would prefer to listen. He meant it. A representative from the local Veterans Affairs Office spoke briefly about the correction of Walter's record and its formal implications. He read a section of Judge Weston's ruling, the part that described the deliberate nature of the original alterations in plain language, and the room listened to it, the way rooms listen to something that confirms what they had already come to believe. Then Walter was asked if he wanted to say anything. He stood. He was the same man he had always been, the navy jacket, the flag pin, the cap that he removed and held in his hands as he stood at the podium, because the room felt like a room where you held your hat. He looked out at the people in the folding chairs. "I'm not going to talk for long," he said. "That's not my way." He paused. He looked down at the cap in his hands, then back up. "I spent a long time being angry," he said. "I didn't always show it, but it was there. A man can carry anger quietly for a very long time, and it doesn't go anywhere just because it's quiet. It just waits." He paused again. "I'm less angry now, not because what was done to me was small. It wasn't. It cost me things I can't get back, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but something true got said, in a room that was required to listen. That matters. That's not nothing." He looked toward Daniel briefly, then toward Emily, then toward Leon. "The people who helped me get here, they didn't do it because they owed me anything. They did it because it was right. And I want to say, for the record, that I know the difference between those two things, and I don't take either of them lightly." He put his cap back on his head. "That's all I have," he said. He stepped back from the podium. The room responded with the kind of applause that is not performative, steady, sustained, the sound of people meaning it rather than filling a moment. Afterward, there was food on the long tables and coffee and the kind of conversation that happens when people who have been through something together find themselves in the same room on the other side of it. Walter moved through the room slowly, speaking to each person who approached him. The veterans, the community members, Emily's mother, a young man who said he was studying law and had followed the case and wanted to know what Walter thought the most important thing about it had been. But Walter considered the question. "That someone kept looking," he said, "when there was no good reason to think they'd find anything." The young man wrote it down. Near the end of the afternoon, when the room had thinned and the folding chairs were being stacked against the wall, Daniel found Walter standing near the window, a different window than the kitchen one, larger, looking out onto a street where the December afternoon was doing what December afternoons did, dimming toward early dark. "My father used to say that the right thing and the easy thing were almost never the same thing," Daniel said. "Smart man," Walter said. "He was." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "He'd have liked to have met you properly, not in a clearing in the dark." Walter looked at the window. "He did meet me properly," he said. He just wasn't conscious for most of it." Daniel laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of him, the kind that released something. Walter did not laugh, but something at the corners of his eyes shifted in a way that was close enough. They stood together for a moment in the way of two people who have been through something and have arrived together at the far side of it. A week later, on a Tuesday morning, Walter walked into a grocery store. Not the Greenfield Supermart on Elm Avenue. A different one, closer to his apartment, a smaller place with narrower aisles and a handwritten specials board near the entrance. He took a basket and moved through the store with the ease of a man who had been doing this his whole life, selecting what he needed: bread, eggs, milk, the ordinary things, and bringing them to the register. There was a woman in front of him in the line. She was older than him by perhaps a decade, moving slowly, and when she reached the register and her card was declined, she stood quietly and looked at the number on the screen with the expression of a person doing very fast and very private arithmetic. The cashier, a young man, patient, ran the card again. Declined again. Walter watched her reach into her purse and begin to look for something else. He stepped forward. He did not make a speech. He did not draw attention. He simply said quietly to the cashier, "Add her items to mine." The woman turned to look at him. She had the expression that he recognized, the particular pride of a person who had not asked for help and was not certain how to receive it without it costing something. "It's not charity," Walter said. He said it gently, and without explanation. "It's just what we do." He held her gaze for a moment, and something in it settled. He paid for both their groceries with the first payment from the pension that had been restored to him. Money that was his, earned through years of service that were now officially, formally, and irrevocably recognized as the years of service they had always been. He carried his own bag out into the December morning. He did not look back to see if anyone had noticed. He never had. If a man can have 50 years of his life erased by one lie, how many more are still waiting for someone to finally look? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. More stories like this one are coming.